Hello, good evening, and welcome back to my channel. For those of you who haven't been here before, welcome. For those of you who have, welcome back. I am Dr. Keisha Ducree, again, your friendly neighborhood Black feminist geographer. And I'm here to talk about something I'm kind of ambivalent about talking about. But I want to talk again about this idea of Black geographies, primarily anti-Black geographies, and why place matters, and how what I mean by that is how we are shaped by time and space, our worldview. And I wanted to provide an example of someone who is in the news and has been in the news recently. Um, and I struggle with talking about this particular person because we are all, as I sit here, it is February 15th, we are all trying to figure out a way to go through our days and trying to figure out how to have hope and resilience in the face of an onslaught of kind of very fascist moves among this administration. And so I don't want to add to the drama and the hysteria and the angst inducing part, but I also feel like I have this role as an educator, that when there is a current event is going on, that when it makes sense to talk about that event in relation to the work and research that I do on Black geographies, that it makes sense. So the purpose of today, again, is to talk about why place matters. And what I mean by place is where we live, work, and play, how we are shaped by the events of that particular place and by the landscape of that particular place. And so I wanted to talk about anti-Black geographies. What does it mean when a person is shaped by anti-Blackness, the absolute void of Black voices, Black bodies, particularly in a place that has a Black presence there, but they're not a part of their social life. And in fact, there's a complete subjugation of Black bodies, Black voices in their lives. And that person comes into an environment that is particularly diverse. And so I refer to that person today as Apartheid Clyde. And I had to say that I didn't come up with that title. I got that from Dr. Tracy. So shout out to Dr. Tracy for introducing me to the title of Apartheid Clyde. And that's the title that I'm going to be using today. So it is anti-Black geographies and how place matters in the case of Apartheid Clyde. Sit back and enjoy. So let me provide a context of why I struggle with this. This channel is really dedicated to Black women, is dedicated to Black feminist geography, and I really want to highlight my travels have a decolonialized lens to the world. But at the same time, again, I'm an educator, and I have a history and experience, particularly on my campus, of when there are these really big events that we have what we call teach-ins on campus. I've been known to organize many of the teach-ins as far back as Hurricane Katrina in 2005 to the George Floyd, the murder trial by his killer. Between that, I organized a teach-in when Michael Brown was murdered, and we first began a discussion, at least on our campus, about Black Lives Matter. So there's always these points ripped straight from the headlines that I think it's important to sit down. I gather a bunch of colleagues from other fields of study, and we tackle a issue in the headlines from different perspectives, from a political scientist or a psychologist or a Black studies professor or a geography professor or a legal expert. So that students, it's an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary approach to a current headline. So in the spirit of my teach-ins that I've organized at Syracuse University, I'm offering you a look at why place matters in the case of apartheid Clyde. So Clyde is all over the news. Clyde has been the biggest donor of the current administration and has been given the leeway, responsibility as an unelected official to make decisions at the very top of government. And the reason why I think it's important to look at Clyde and to look at his place is because he is in a position of extreme power without the accountability. What does Clyde think? And in the absence of Clyde sitting down and talking deeply about what he thinks more broadly about the world, about society, about Black people, about diversity, we can draw some assumptions about what his ideology might be when it comes to the diverse country that is the United States. And so Clyde did not grow up in the United States. And so the most influential period in anyone's life is where they're born and where they're raised. And so Clyde was born in South Africa. Clyde and I are the same age. We both were born when Nelson Mandela was in prison. Nelson Mandela, as you know, was a political prisoner whose fervent fights against South Africa's regime of strict racial apartheid. And he was sentenced, he spent decades in prison. By the time, I think, during the height of the kind of anti-apartheid global movement, I would say reached height in the 1980s and 1990s, and Mandela was released in the mid-1990s. And this is a relentless campaign of activists outside of South Africa in through the support of sanctions, really trying to cripple the South African government to abolish its system of apartheid. So this is the place. I'm not shaped necessarily by Mandela and the apartheid system. I was born in the United States. I am shaped by other things, and we could talk about that, certainly. But Clyde was born at the height of this. He was born within a family of wealth. And talk a little bit about his family in a minute. But I also want to, let me back up and say, I want to give you points so you can follow along on this discussion. So this is about why place matters and why we can how we understand the kind of spatial imagination, particularly when it comes to race, by apartheid Clyde. So there are 4 points that I want you to consider when we think about how place matters to a person, given the environment and the influences within that person's life. So I've already talked about the first point without saying it was the first point. So the first one of 4 is the fact that apartheid Clyde was born and raised. He was there until high school, his formative years. He was born and raised within the most strict and oppressive racial system in the modern era. Okay, that's how I put it. So to try to give you a small history lesson in South Africa. South Africa had the distinct point by the 1990s, by the time that Mandela is political influence and sanctions had given to the South African government, not only to release Mandela, but to create a voting parity among Black South Africans. The issue of land is still not sufficient. But by that point, a small minority of whites had owned, stolen the land from native Black South Africans and completely controlled the system, administrative, legal system, private business system of a country in which they were a numerical minority. And so this is the space that Clyde is born into, that the law of the land, there is normality to white control, numerical minority white control in a Black country. And that control is oppressive. Includes sweeping restrictions of Black people's mobility, Black South Africans' mobility, not having the power to vote, not having the power to move and live and work freely, a very, very rigid racial hierarchy with white supremacy being the law of the land. So that has to, if we think about it, that has to matter, right? Living in a space that is Black, but recognizing that your place in that system being white as being the ones that are in charge, a numerical minority. And so living in this space, we know that if you think about place matters, Clyde grows up and his family is operating in Pretoria. Pretoria is very important because Pretoria is the administrative capital of white supremacist apartheid system. You know, when we think about South Africa today, we think about Cape Town, we think about Johannesburg, but Pretoria is really the capital, the administrative capital city of the seat of white power in South Africa. So if he had been maybe somewhere else, there may be a chance that he would encounter more Black bodies, more diverse voices, dissent, but being literally located in the place, in the site of the white supremacist apparatus in the country means something as well. So he goes there, he lives there, he goes to school there. And that is number two. Number two is, number one, he's in South Africa under apartheid. And number two, he's actually in Pretoria, the administrative apparatus for white supremacy in apartheid in South Africa. Number three is related to all this, and that is kind of the absolute zero presence of Black life in this space in Pretoria. At this point, when he's growing up, the dissent may have been far removed from him. Okay. Number four, the interesting thing about Clyde is his family. And so while he is born and raised in South Africa, largely during the height of the apartheid regime, his mother is also raised, but was born or has citizenship to Canada. And I'm going to provide a link. This is almost a response to, I was compelled to tell this story because it's a response to Democracy Now, two-episode arc of Democracy Now that they entitled PayPal Mafia. And the PayPal Mafia is referring to a group of PayPal, the actual payment system co-founders, who are some of the most powerful men who all have links to South Africa. They are white South Africans. And it is a jaw-dropping account of a biographer, a journalist from The Guardian. So I'll provide a link for that. But that's the video that really compelled me to say, you know what? I want to share that place really matters, and how these very wealthy white South Africans who are in their 50s or so are greatly influenced, were born and raised in this bubble of white supremacy that is akin to maybe 1930s United States. And what this means for these very, very powerful men, not in terms of their wealth, but their political power in backing American politicians, and how that worldview of kind of an absolute totalitarian form of white supremacy leaves no room for Black voices or bodies or any kind of racial equality, none whatsoever. So in these clips called the PayPal Mafia, my jaw dropped open at what the journalist reveals to Amy Goodman about Apartheid Clyde's Canadian heritage. And he uses his Canadian heritage through his mother, and therefore through his mother's parents, to migrate to Canada. After he finishes high school, he migrates to Canada, wherein he shortly then migrates to the United States. Apartheid Clyde cannot go straight from South Africa to the United States because he has no claims to be really in the United States. He uses the path of a Canadian citizenship to ultimately get to the United States, where he has been and where he is now controlling a significant portion of the American government budget. Frightening indeed. So back to his grandfather. Get this. You listening? His grandfather I'm not sure if he's alive. Correct me let me know. I'll find out after this recording. His grandfather was a Nazi sympathizer. I know. It is like, you're like, why is a Canadian a Nazi sympathizer? Like, how does this come to be? And this is this is not about being a sympathizer now. Like, this is in the 1950s. Okay, this is in the heart of. He is really a Nazi sympathizer in the heart of it, and as a person connected to Canadian politics, yay for Canada, he was really ostracized about his Nazi sympathy and his ideas about anti-Semitism that translates into also a strongly white supremacist approach, right? So he is drawn to South Africa because for him and those like him, South Africa and its total control, land and political control of a small minority of white people over a Black country is great, is the model for what white supremacists would crave, right? Despite despite the predominant population, that there's this total control that white supremacists can hold over it. So Clyde's grandfather loves the dream and the model of South Africa's apartheid, and he goes and he raises his daughter, Clyde's mother, there. And it is again with this link to Canada in the application for Canadian citizenship based on his own birthright or his mother's, he's able to go and make his way out of South Africa and into the the Canadian and then the US system. So yeah, those are the 4 points that I think that are very important. And the point of me stressing this again is this idea about Black geographies, or in this case, anti-Black geographies, and how place matters. That this is a person who influence and biography, his spatial biography, and therefore his thinking is rooted in an ideology that is about complete white supremacy over Black subjugation. Like, that is the norm. It is not a fiction. It is not a book to read. He lived and breathed and learned within an environment where that was normal. And I can't help but think, if place matters and if apartheid Clyde has this ideology, he has to embrace it or understand it. And what does that mean for him pseudo governing a place that is diverse as the United States? Again, I don't want to be a fear monger. I bring it up only because this Clyde is running the show. And Clyde comes from a place and an ideology where white supremacists run the show. Now, again, the other side of this is not to cause despair, but I also tell, folks that while space can be oppressive, extreme space of displacing people from their land and finding reservations, townships, concentration camps, or whatever kind of spatial boundary that you're using to hold people when you steal their land from them or hold them in punishment of their identity, their racial identity, that space has been organized to create these spaces of control. But every movement for liberation is also spatial. Every resistance is spatial. Thinking back to the lunch counter sit-ins of the late 50s, early 60s, resistance is about breaking out of those oppressive spaces and inserting oneself, sometimes by force, at least civil disobedience, into spaces that we have been barred from. So I want you to remember, if I leave you with anything, the idea that space can be organized to make rigid social categories, and could be race and spatial organizing could be oppressive. The act of resistance is also overcoming those spaces. So in that, I hope to leave you with some hope. I certainly do. I'm going to go protest tomorrow. I hope you are too. So take this as it is, my couple of minutes of projecting. And again, place matters, either in enforcing rigid rules or in breaking them. Have a good day.